Robert Taft feared something that many Americans after World War II no longer wanted to hear: that war changes republics, not only militarily, not only economically, but constitutionally, psychologically, institutionally. And as America emerged from World War II into a new role as a global superpower, Taft increasingly feared the country was becoming something fundamentally different from the republic it had once been, not through conquest from abroad, but through permanent mobilization from within. In the last episode, we explored Taft's political philosophy, his belief in constitutional limits, his fear of emergency power, his suspicion of centralized authority. But ideas only truly reveal themselves when tested by history. And Robert Taft's ideas were tested in one of the most transformative periods in modern American history, the years surrounding World War II and its aftermath. Because by the 1940s, America was rapidly changing, and so was the Republican Party. But to understand Taft's post-war fears, you first have to understand his attitude towards war itself, because before World War II, Taft belonged to a strain of American political thought deeply skeptical of foreign entanglement. Not because he admired fascism, he did not, and not because he was indifferent to the dangers emerging in Europe and Asia, but because he feared what large-scale foreign wars would do, not only to lives abroad, but to constitutional government at home. Like many Americans of his generation, Taft believed the First World War had dramatically expanded centralized power, bureaucracy, executive authority, economic control, and he feared another global war would accelerate that process even further. His position increasingly placed him at odds with the growing interventionist mood of the country, especially as the crisis in Europe deepened. And as Franklin Roosevelt pushed America closer towards involvement, Taft remained cautious. Concerned not simply with military policy, but with what wartime mobilization would do to the structure of the republic itself. At the same time, Taft was not disconnected from international realities. He warned that American policy toward Japan risked provoking the war in the Pacific. He believed escalating economic pressure and confrontation could eventually trigger a military response, though he expected any major attack would more likely target the Philippines rather than Hawaii. So while he misjudged the exact form the conflict would take, the broader warning itself revealed something important. Taft was not simply arguing from isolation. He was thinking seriously about consequences, about escalation, and about how great powers drift into wars that later reshape them politically from within. And then came Pearl Harbor. The political atmosphere changed almost overnight. National unity surged. Military mobilization expanded rapidly, and America entered the largest war in its history. After that point, the older politics of restraint and non-entanglement became increasingly difficult to sustain publicly. Because the war did not merely defeat America's enemies, it transformed America's position in the world. The United States emerged from World War II not weakened, but dominant. Europe was shattered. Empires were collapsing. The Soviet Union was expanding, and many Americans began to believe the United States now had a permanent responsibility to manage global order itself. For many, this new role felt both necessary and inevitable. But for Taft, it also raised an unsettling question. Could a republic remain constitutionally restrained while permanently organized around global military responsibility? Because after the war, something fundamental began to change. Military alliances expanded. Defense spending surged. Intelligence agencies grew. Executive authority increased. and increasingly foreign policy became permanent, not temporary, not exceptional, but structural. And this is where Taft began to diverge sharply from the emerging consensus, because Taft feared that permanent global involvement would inevitably transform the American Republic itself, not simply its military posture, but its institutions, its political culture, its constitutional balance, because Taft understood something history repeatedly demonstrates, that nations organized around permanent conflict gradually reorganize themselves around centralized power, and once that process begins, it rarely reverses easily. This became especially clear during the debate over NATO. To many Americans, NATO appeared straightforward, a defensive alliance, a safeguard against Soviet expansion. But Taft worried about something deeper. He feared that permanent military alliances would slowly erode congressional authority over war itself, because if the United States became permanently committed to defending large portions of the world, then military mobilization would also become permanent. And if military mobilization became permanent, executive power would inevitably expand alongside it. This was not abstract to Taft, it was constitutional. He feared that Congress, the branch closest to the people, would gradually surrender its authority to a permanently empowered executive apparatus. And once surrendered, such powers rarely return voluntarily. For Taft, war did not merely increase presidential power temporarily. It normalizes expansion. Every emergency created new precedents, new bureaucracies, new justifications, and over time, citizens themselves became accustomed to levels of centralized authority earlier generations might have considered alarming. At one point, Taft warned that the modern presidency had become as powerful as 100 senators. That was not rhetoric, it was diagnosis, because he increasingly believed the constitutional balance envisioned by earlier generations was slowly disappearing, not through dictatorship, not through a coup, but gradually, administratively, through crisis after crisis. And yet, this is also where Taft's position became difficult, because the Soviet threat was real. Communism was expanding. Eastern Europe had fallen behind the Iron Curtain. China would soon become communist, and many Americans genuinely feared what might come next. Taft understood this. He was not naive about Soviet power. He never was. Nor was he indifferent to the dangers of communism. But he feared something else as well, that in attempting to defend free societies abroad, America might slowly transform the nature of its own republic at home. And perhaps this is one reason Taft remains so compelling, because he wrestled seriously with a question that still has no easy answer. How does a free society defend itself without becoming permanently organized around fear? And increasingly, Taft found himself out of step with the direction of his own party, because the Republican Party itself was changing. The older tradition of restraint, skepticism towards entanglement, and fear of centralized executive authority was slowly giving way to a more internationalist vision. A vision of permanent global responsibility, permanent alliances, permanent military readiness, and in many ways, Taft's struggle was not simply against Democrats, it was against the future direction of American politics itself. And perhaps this is one reason I've been drawn to Taft as a historical figure, because in an age when intervention abroad and military expansion often feel almost unquestioned, even or especially among Republicans, Taft reminds us that this was not always the dominant tendency. There once existed a serious strain of American political thought deeply concerned with restraint, with constitutional balance, with the long-term consequences of centralized power during war and crisis. And whether one ultimately agrees with Taft or not, I think there is something healthy about revisiting figures like him now, because he forces us to confront questions modern politics often prefers to avoid. Not simply, how do we project power, but what does permanent power projection eventually do to a republic? Because history suggests something uncomfortable, that empires rarely remain psychologically identical to the republics from which they emerge. Global responsibility changes incentives, changes institutions, changes expectations, and over time, citizens themselves begin to normalize concentrations of power that once would have seemed extraordinary. Not because they desire tyranny, but because fear, uncertainty, and crisis make expansion feel reasonable, necessary, and patriotic. And Taft feared what happens once that process becomes permanent. What makes Robert Taft so fascinating is not that he rejected power entirely. He did not. Nor was he blind to danger. What made him unusual was that he remained deeply suspicious of concentrated power, even when fear made expansion politically rewarding, even when much of the country believed history itself demanded it, because Taft understood something many societies only realized too late, that republics rarely lose restraint all at once. They lose it gradually, through emergencies, through precedents, through the slow normalization of powers once considered temporary, and once societies grow accustomed to expansion, they begin to forget what limits were meant to protect in the first place. That is why Taft matters, not because he was perfect, not because he was always right, but because he wrestled seriously with a question modern politics often avoids. How does free societies preserve restraint when fear makes restraint feel irresponsible? And perhaps that is why figures like Taft feel so rare now, because in democratic politics, the man warning about the long-term dangers of power will almost always struggle against the man promising immediate security. In the next episode, we move from Taft's conflict with war and executive power to his final political battles. Because of the Republican Party changing around him, Taft increasingly became influential and isolated, a man fighting not simply for policies, but for an older vision of the American Republic itself. I'll see you in the next episode.